Las Vegas, 1970. The city pulsed with neon and excess, its casinos bursting with gamblers chasing illusions. Night after night, Elvis Presley lit up the stage at the International Hotel. Every show sold out, every seat trembling under the roar of adoration. The king was back, larger than life. But not tonight. Instead of retreating to champagne suites and velvet-draped halls, Elvis slipped away into the desert night, his rhinestones traded for a plain jacket. He walked into a roadside diner where the lights flickered and the air smelled of grease and burnt coffee. No bodyguards, no spotlight, just truckers, tourists, and tired waitresses who didn't know what to do with the quiet man at the back booth. Some recognized him, but stayed frozen, afraid to break the fragile line between myth and reality. And then it happened. One careless insult, sharp and mocking, cut through the silence. The room stilled, breaths caught, and in that instant everyone realized they weren't about to witness a performance. They were about to witness the man behind the legend, and a moment that no one present would ever forget. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The desert air outside Las Vegas was still warm long after midnight, carrying with it the faint scent of gasoline, dust, and cigarette smoke that clung to the city like a second skin. Neon signs blinked and hummed in the distance, announcing casinos and motels that promised fortunes and comfort, but delivered mostly illusions. The Strip was still alive, endless headlights sliding past as showgirls, gamblers, and tourists poured in and out of buildings designed to swallow them whole. For Elvis Presley, however, the night no longer glowed. He had just left the International Hotel, where only an hour earlier he'd been showered with cheers from thousands. The audience had screamed his name, tossed flowers toward the stage, and demanded encore after encore. Under the spotlights, drenched in sweat, he had given them everything. Hips snapping, voice soaring, the jumpsuit gleaming with rhinestones. It was triumph, the kind that once would have set his blood racing. But as the limousine eased away from the hotel entrance, with fans pressing against the windows, he felt something hollow instead of victory. Fame could roar louder than any crowd. Tonight, he wanted silence. He didn't want chandeliers or champagne. He wanted to taste something ordinary, to sit at a table that didn't belong to spectacle. For years, he had been trying to chase down that sense of normalcy, something plain and unvarnished that might remind him of the man he was before all of this. So he asked his driver not to head for Graceland's Vegas suite, not to circle him back to the guarded comfort of luxury. Instead, he asked to be taken somewhere off the Strip, away from velvet curtains and valet parking. "Find me a place where the locals eat," he said softly, in the accent that never left him, the one people in the North still sometimes mocked as too slow, too country. The car rolled into an older part of town, where neon was less polished and the sidewalks cracked under years of heat. On a corner, glowing in tired pink letters, was a sign: Blue Star Diner. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few dusty pickups and an 18-wheeler idling in the back. The sign buzzed faintly, as if protesting the work of staying alive. It was exactly what he wanted. He slipped out of the car, wearing nothing flashy, just dark slacks, a loose shirt, and a jacket. His hair was still slicked, but without the stage lights it looked less like a crown and more like a habit. A couple of men standing by their trucks squinted in his direction. One whispered something to the other, then shook his head. Surely not, they thought. The king wouldn't be here, not at a place where the vinyl seats had rips taped over with duct tape and the jukebox rattled out-of-tune country singles. Inside, The air was heavy with the smell of fried onions, burnt coffee, and grease that never quite washed out of the linoleum. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale, almost sickly glow. The booths were filled with tired faces, two truck drivers finishing their late meals, a small group of tourists with sunburnt cheeks, a middle-aged couple quietly eating pie. A jukebox in the corner was trying to push out a tune by Hank Williams, though the sound cracked and wavered. Elvis chose a booth near the back, by the window. He kept his head low, letting the shadows cover most of his face. For a few minutes, it worked. People glanced, then looked away, assuming he was just another man worn out from work. Without the white jumpsuit, without the stage swagger, he could almost pass for ordinary. Almost. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a pencil stuck in her hair, placed a menu in front of him without a word. She didn't look twice. That, strangely, felt like a relief. Elvis opened the menu, though he didn't need to. He wasn't here for fine dining. A simple burger, fries, maybe a Coke, something that tasted like old days before everything became a performance. He was studying the faded print when the waiter arrived. Not the same woman, but a boy. Hardly 20, with slicked-back hair and sleeves rolled to the elbow as though he thought the job beneath him. He tapped his notepad impatiently. "What'll it be?" Elvis looked up, smiled politely, and spoke in the soft drawl that clung to him like his own skin. "Burger, fries, and a Coke, please." The boy tilted his head, then repeated the words in an exaggerated imitation of that southern lilt. "Burger, fries, and a Coke." He stretched out the syllables until the table of tourists giggled and the truckers grinned uncomfortably. The imitation wasn't kind. It was sharp, meant to make a fool out of him. For a heartbeat, Elvis froze. The sound hit him deeper than anyone in the room could understand. All his life, that accent had been a mark against him. First in schoolyards, then in boardrooms, where record men thought he sounded too poor, too backwoods. Even after he sold millions of records, people still sneered. It was never just about words. It was about who he was, where he came from, the dirt under his childhood fingernails, the poverty he couldn't scrub away. The boy smirked, enjoying the ripple of laughter his mimicry had caused. To him, the customer was just another Southerner to mock. He hadn't yet realized who sat before him. Or maybe he had, and mocking was easier than admitting awe. Around the room, people began to fall silent. Recognition crept across faces, tentative at first, then sure. Whispers passed like static. "That's him. That's really him." The tourists stopped giggling. One of the truckers leaned back, squinting. A woman by the counter clutched her coffee cup a little tighter. But Elvis said nothing. He only looked at the boy steadily, eyes calm but unreadable. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing into every corner of the diner. Even the jukebox seemed to falter mid-note. The boy shifted under the gaze but held on to his smirk, as though doubling down would save him. "What's the matter?" "Don't like the way it sounds?" he asked, feigning innocence. Elvis lowered his eyes to the table, running a hand slowly across the scratched surface of the booth. He wasn't angry, not yet. But somewhere deep inside, an old ache stirred, the one that never fully left, no matter how many gold records lined his walls. The silence inside the diner thickened, like smoke no fan could clear away. The boy with the notepad still stood by the booth, pretending confidence, though the shift in the room's air was unmistakable. The earlier snickers had faded, replaced with something uneasy, as if everyone suddenly realized they had been caught watching something they shouldn't. Elvis didn't answer right away. His stillness was its own reply. He leaned back in the booth, gaze steady on the young man, the drawl of his voice unspoken but present in the weight of the moment. For a long stretch, no one dared speak above a whisper. Forks hovered in midair. Pie crusts remained uneaten. The jukebox, mercifully, sputtered to a stop between songs, leaving only the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs above. One of the truckers shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. His hands were calloused, his face weathered from years under sun and wind, and the creased brim of his cap marked him as a man who had known work and loss in equal measure. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed back from his table and stood. His boots thudded against the linoleum as he walked toward the booth where Elvis sat. "Son," the man said, turning not to Elvis but to the waiter, "do you know who you're standing in front of?" His voice was low, but carried the authority of someone who had seen combat and didn't waste words. "This man's given more to this country than you can measure. Don't you ever forget it." The boy's smirk faltered, just slightly. He glanced around, expecting support, but found none. A couple of tourists avoided his eyes. The older woman at the counter nodded faintly, as if confirming the trucker's words. But instead of backing down, the young man doubled his grin. Louder this time, his laughter high and forced. "All I see's another guy ordering fries. I don't see no king here. You all act like he's some kind of saint. He's just a singer." That's all. His tone cut through the diner, brittle and defiant. He thought humor would save him, but the words cracked in the air like broken glass. The trucker's jaw clenched, but he didn't move closer. His respect for Elvis kept him from turning the moment into a brawl. Instead, he stepped back, shaking his head in quiet disgust, and returned to his table. The room grew heavier still. Every person inside was watching Elvis now, waiting for him to strike back, to put the boy in his place with the authority of someone adored by millions. But Elvis remained motionless, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed not in anger, but in a kind of mournful patience. Inside him, though, the words had landed like blows. They weren't new. They never were. He had been laughed at for that same accent since childhood, in Tupelo and later in Memphis, mocked for the clothes his mother had patched, for the shoes worn thin. Even after he rose to stardom, after the gold and platinum, after the sold-out arenas, the sting never left. Some part of him always remained that boy from a shotgun shack, struggling to hold on to pride. And now, here, in a greasy roadside diner, the same sneer resurfaced. It wasn't about fries or Coke. It was about history, the long shadow of humiliation he carried in his chest. He remembered standing outside his school in Mississippi, hearing older boys mimic the way he spoke. He remembered the record executives in New York, laughing under their breath, calling him too country for radio. He remembered nights on the road in '54, playing dance halls where audiences sneered at his mama's accent in his voice. The memory of those wounds flickered behind his still expression, but none of it showed on his face now. He stayed calm, letting the silence deepen until even the boy shifted uneasily. The crowd leaned in, their breaths held. They could sense the storm gathering, though Elvis's posture gave away nothing. For him, it was not about retaliation. He could have snapped his fingers and crushed the boy with humiliation, drowned him under the applause of everyone present. But what would that have proven? That he was bigger, louder, richer? That was never the battle. The true fight was against that voice in his head, telling him he was still the dirt-poor kid no one took seriously. Around the room, people waited for the explosion. Instead, what they saw was a man wrestling with his own ghosts, fighting not the boy, but the memory of every time someone told him he wasn't enough. The veteran trucker lowered his head respectfully, almost as if he understood. The couple by the window held hands, whispering softly to each other. The air was so tense it felt like it might snap. And through it all, Elvis remained silent, carrying himself with the kind of composure that can only come from years of learning when not to rise to bait. Yet the ache was there, unmistakable, filling the diner with a sense that something far larger than a late-night meal was unfolding. The boy's grin faltered again as he realized the laughter had died completely. His attempt at humor now felt hollow, hanging in the air without echo. He glanced at Elvis once more, but the look he received in return wasn't anger. It was something steadier, something he couldn't name, but that made his stomach twist. The customers knew instinctively that this wasn't over. Something was about to break the silence, and when it did, the room would not be the same. The silence cracked when Elvis moved. Slow, deliberate, he slid from the booth and rose to his full height. Chairs creaked as people shifted to watch. The boy with the notepad stiffened, unsure whether to step back or stand his ground. But Elvis didn't bristle with anger. There was no raised voice, no threat in his stance. Instead, he walked toward the young man with the composure of someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than a late-night insult. He stopped just in front of him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elvis leaned slightly forward, his voice quiet but clear, carrying across the entire room. "Burger, fries, and a Coke, please." He spoke it exactly as before, each syllable rolling with that unmistakable Southern cadence. Only this time, the words held no trace of shame. The accent was deliberate, sharpened by pride, rather than softened by self-consciousness. It was the sound of Tupelo fields, of gospel tents, of Memphis nights where blues bled from Beale Street. It was the foundation of everything that had built him, and he delivered it like a challenge. The boy's smirk faltered instantly. The repetition was no joke now. It was a declaration. Elvis's tone carried weight, a gravity that pressed into the room and left the waiter blinking under its force. Then Elvis turned, not just to the boy, but to everyone watching. His gaze swept across the diner, pausing on faces, making each person feel as though he were speaking directly to them. "You hear this?" he said, tapping his own chest lightly. "This voice, this way of speaking. It's my mama's voice. It's the voice of the place I was born, in a house so small the wind came through the cracks in winter. It's the voice of neighbors singing gospel on Sunday mornings. Without it, there wouldn't be a song I ever sang worth listening to. Not one." The room stayed hushed, every ear straining. When people made fun of it, I thought maybe I should change, sound like somebody else. But then I realized, if I lost this, I'd lose myself. And if I lost myself, none of you would have heard a single note that mattered. He paused, letting the words hang. The fluorescent buzz above seemed to fade, the clatter of dishes forgotten. The boy in front of him shifted his weight, staring at the floor. And then, unexpectedly, Elvis's voice softened into melody. No stage lights, no band, no microphone, just his bare voice filling the diner like smoke curling through the air. It was an old gospel tune, one he'd learned as a child kneeling beside his mother at the Assembly of God church. "Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home." The words drifted with a rawness that bypassed polish. He didn't belt it the way he might on stage. He sang it the way he had as a boy, unguarded, from the marrow. The sound carried weight, not in volume, but in truth, vibrating against the walls of the diner until even the harsh light felt softer. A woman at the counter pressed her hand to her mouth. One of the truckers blinked hard, his eyes wet. A couple who had been whispering earlier now sat frozen, hands entwined, moved by something neither could quite name. The melody wrapped itself around the room, changing the air entirely. What had begun as mockery now became something near sacred. Even the boy who'd mocked him could not lift his eyes. Elvis ended the verse and let the silence fall again. For a long moment, no one moved. The echo of his voice seemed to linger, like it refused to be chased away. Then, almost imperceptibly, shoulders straightened around the room. Something had shifted. They weren't staring at a celebrity anymore. They were looking at a man who had turned insult into strength, who carried his roots like armor. The young waiter's face burned crimson. He clutched his notepad tighter, wishing it could hide him. The laughter he had tried to spark had dissolved into something far heavier, and now every eye in the diner was fixed not on him, but on the figure standing with calm defiance. It was no longer a question of who held the power in the room. The moment had made it clear. For Elvis, it wasn't about conquering the boy. It was about claiming the piece of himself he had been told to bury. And now, standing in the middle of a tired roadside diner, he had done just that. The customers, though silent, seemed to know they had witnessed something larger than a confrontation. They had seen dignity reassert itself in the face of ridicule. And Elvis, he didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply lowered his gaze, nodding slightly, as if to say, "This is who I am." The boy, still frozen, had no words. For the first time since he'd opened his mouth, it was clear he didn't know what to do. The tension that had wrapped the diner since Elvis first placed his order was finally breaking, but not into noise, into reverence, into the realization that sometimes the quietest words echo the loudest. The diner was still wrapped in the hush that followed his song. It wasn't the kind of silence born of shock anymore. It was reverent, as though the four walls had been transformed into a chapel without anyone meaning to. People sat in place, unwilling to disturb the fragile weight of what had just happened. Even the clatter from the kitchen had stopped, pots left unstirred, as the cooks pressed closer to the service window to see. Then, from one of the corner booths, came the sound of quiet weeping. A gray-haired woman, her hand trembling as she pressed a napkin to her face, rose slowly to her feet. Her shoulders shook as she took a step forward, then another, until she stood a few feet away from Elvis. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the stillness. "That hymn," she said, pausing to steady herself. "They sang it at my husband's funeral. He was killed in Vietnam, and hearing you sing it again tonight, it felt like I could see him sitting right here beside me." The words cracked halfway through, but she pushed them out, clutching the napkin like a lifeline. Tears streaked her cheeks. A murmur spread through the room, a current of shared grief and memory. Elvis bowed his head, the corners of his mouth tightening in something like sorrow. He stepped closer and gently placed a hand over hers, not as a star consoling a fan, but as one person offering comfort to another. The woman squeezed his hand, then let it go, returning to her booth, still dabbing at her eyes. The weight in the air shifted again. Less heavy now, more communal, as though everyone inside the diner had been linked by invisible thread. They weren't just customers anymore. They were witnesses, pulled together by one man's decision to bare his soul in the middle of the night. But peace never lasts long, when pride has been wounded. The young waiter, red-faced and cornered by the gravity of what had unfolded, lashed out to salvage himself. He lifted his chin, speaking louder than necessary, his voice jagged with false confidence. "You're all acting like this is some kind of miracle. He sneered. "It's just a song. He ain't holy. He's a performer, and you all are eating it up like sheep." The words sliced into the air, ugly against the tenderness that had filled the room moments before. People turned on him instantly. The trucker slammed his fist against the table. "Watch your mouth, boy," he barked. "That man's earned more respect than you'll see in 10 lifetimes." Others muttered their disapproval. The tourists who had once laughed at the waiter's imitation now looked disgusted, their faces pale under the fluorescent light. The woman who had spoken of her husband glared at him, shaking her head in disbelief. For a few seconds, the crowd was ready to break apart, fury bubbling beneath the surface. Words flew in sharp whispers, and the room teetered on the edge of open confrontation. The young man shrank slightly, realizing too late that his attempt at defiance had only made him look smaller. And yet, in that moment, Elvis stepped forward again, not to escalate, but to still the storm. He raised his hand gently, palm outward, a gesture that carried more authority than any shouted command. The voices quieted, one by one, until the diner was hushed again, save for the faint hum of electricity in the lights above. "Don't blame him," Elvis said quietly, his voice carrying warmth even as it steadied the room. "He's young. He doesn't know yet what he'll come to learn. We've all been there. It was not what the crowd expected. Many wanted him to humiliate the boy, to deliver some sharp line that would settle the matter once and for all. But Elvis had no interest in turning cruelty back on cruelty. His strength lay in restraint, in showing the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or faked. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, he looked small, exposed in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Elvis's mercy cut deeper than anger ever could. Around the room, people exchanged glances, their admiration swelling. They saw now not just a singer, not just a performer, but a man with a kind of nobility that didn't come from fame. It came from lived pain, from choices made in moments like this. The trucker leaned back in his seat, nodding to himself. The woman in the corner clasped her hands together, her tears slowing. Even the tourists seemed humbled, their earlier giggles replaced by quiet awe. The boy dropped his gaze to the floor, the fight draining from him. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the notepad, unsure whether to retreat to the kitchen or stand frozen where he was. Elvis returned to his booth and sat down, his presence commanding without needing a throne or spotlight. The air settled again, calmer this time, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Everyone in the diner knew the moment wasn't finished, that there was still more to come, that the young man's lesson and Elvis's quiet defiance had only just begun. And so they waited, caught between the echoes of a hymn and the rawness of a confrontation that had turned into something larger than any of them had expected. The tension in the diner lingered like static in the air. People had seen the mockery, the song, the rebuke, and the grace, but no one was ready for what would happen next. The sound of the front door swinging open broke the fragile stillness, letting in a rush of desert air and the hum of a truck engine idling outside. A group of young men stepped inside, laughing loudly, their energy cutting through the subdued atmosphere. At the center was one who immediately drew attention. A soldier in uniform, his fatigues still carrying the dust of travel. The patches on his sleeve identified him as someone recently home from Vietnam. His gait was uneven, but steady enough to show he was determined to stand tall. The moment his eyes adjusted to the fluorescent glow, he froze. His laughter died. The others quieted as they followed his gaze. There, at a booth in the corner, sat the man whose voice had carried across oceans and jungles, Elvis Presley. The soldier's face shifted from disbelief to something almost reverent. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his boots echoing across the linoleum. Conversations fell silent again. "Sir," he said, his voice rough, worn by war, "I need to tell you something." Elvis looked up, giving him his full attention. The soldier swallowed hard, fighting to steady his words. "I had a cassette player over there," he began, his hand unconsciously brushing the side of his uniform where a pocket would have held it. "When things got bad, and God knows they got bad, I'd put in your tapes. I'd sit in the dirt, listening to Love Me Tender, or If I Can Dream, and it felt like somebody out there still remembered we were human. That voice. It pulled me through nights I thought I'd never survive." His words cracked with emotion, and he blinked hard, unwilling to let tears fall in front of strangers. The diner held its breath, the weight of his testimony pressed into every corner. Applause broke out suddenly, scattered at first, then building as more hands joined. The truckers clapped. The tourists clapped. Even the woman who had wept earlier clapped, tears glistening again. The soldier, overwhelmed, turned slightly, embarrassed by the outpouring, but the gratitude in the room was undeniable. Elvis stood, meeting the soldier halfway. He gripped his hand firmly, both men holding longer than formality required. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," Elvis said softly. "You gave more than any of us ever will." The soldier nodded, jaw tight, unable to speak further. But the message had already been carved into the night. Elvis's music had been more than entertainment. It had been survival for those far from home. The crowd's focus shifted back to Elvis. Admiration deepened. The young waiter, still clutching his notepad near the counter, looked smaller by the second, shrinking beneath the weight of what had just been said. He had tried to turn Elvis into a caricature, and now here stood living proof that his songs had carried men through war. And then Elvis did something no one expected. Instead of basking in the soldier's praise, instead of using it to further highlight the boy's disrespect, he turned toward the young waiter and said, "Why don't you come sit with me a while?" The boy blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yeah," Elvis answered simply, gesturing to the empty space in the booth. "Take a seat." The diner gasped collectively. It was the last thing anyone anticipated. The trucker muttered under his breath, confused. The woman by the counter frowned, as though she wanted the boy punished instead. But Elvis's face was steady, calm, almost kind. The waiter hesitated, looking around the room for an escape. But with so many eyes on him, refusal felt impossible. His feet dragged as he made his way toward the booth. He slid into the seat opposite Elvis, his posture stiff, his notepad still in hand like a shield. The room was silent again, waiting to see what would happen. People expected Elvis to humiliate him gently, to teach him a lesson in front of everyone. But the singer had something else in mind. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, but loud enough for the room to hear. "You remind me of someone I used to be," he said. "Back when I thought I had to act tougher than I felt, so nobody saw how scared I was." The boy's eyes flicked up, confused. No one had ever compared him to Elvis Presley before. The words unsettled him, loosening the arrogance he had worn like armor. "Sometimes," Elvis continued, "a man laughs at others because he can't stand what he sees in the mirror. I know that feeling. I carried it a long time." The boy shifted, uncomfortable but listening. For the first time, his defiance cracked into something rawer: uncertainty. The customers leaned in, unable to look away. They had expected confrontation, punishment. Instead, they were witnessing something entirely different: compassion, where vengeance could have been easy. Elvis sat back, giving the boy space, his expression calm. I asked you to sit because I see more in you than a cheap joke. You got a fire in you. It just needs pointing the right way. The boy stared down at his notepad, the lines of mockery gone from his face. His lips parted, but no sound came. Shame mixed with something else. Recognition, maybe even respect. The soldier, still standing nearby, watched silently, his eyes glistening again, but this time not from pain. He was witnessing a different kind of courage, the courage to forgive. The diner had become more than a late-night stop. It was a theater of humanity, every person inside bound together by the strange, unexpected grace of a man who could have crushed his critic, but instead offered him a seat at the table. And in that moment, Elvis Presley rose higher than any stage spotlight could have lifted him. The young waiter sat stiffly in the booth across from Elvis, every movement awkward, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He kept glancing at the door, calculating whether he could bolt without making things worse, but the weight of the room held him in place. Every eye in the diner was on that booth, the hush so complete that the scrape of a fork somewhere in the back sounded like thunder. Elvis didn't rush. He let the silence stretch until it lost its sharp edge, then leaned forward, resting his arms on the table in a posture of calm familiarity. His voice, when it came, was gentle. "What's your name, son?" The boy cleared his throat, almost inaudibly. "Tommy." "Tommy," Elvis repeated, nodding as if tasting the name. "Where'd you grow up?" The question caught the boy off guard. He expected a lecture, a scolding, maybe even a dismissal. Instead, he was being asked about his own life. He hesitated, then muttered, "North Las Vegas." Trailer Park off Owens. Elvis smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried recognition instead of pity. "I know places like that. I was raised in a little shack in Tupelo. 2 rooms. When it rained, we had to put buckets on the floor to keep the water from swallowing us." Tommy's eyes flickered, unsure whether to believe him. He had only ever seen Elvis on posters and television, draped in rhinestones, surrounded by adoring crowds. The idea of him growing up poor didn't fit the picture. "Had one pair of shoes that didn't fit right," Elvis continued, his tone unhurried. "Kids at school used to laugh when they saw the holes. They laughed at my clothes, my drawl, even the way I walked. Some days I went home so ashamed I wanted to disappear." The boy shifted, his bravado thinning. His own childhood had been painted in the same colors: hand-me-downs, laughter from classmates, a father who vanished when he was 10. He had worn his sarcasm like a shield ever since, believing cruelty was safer than vulnerability. Elvis studied him quietly, reading the shift in his expression. "You thought making fun of me tonight would get you a laugh, maybe give you the upper hand." He didn't raise his voice. The steadiness made it harder to hide. "But the truth is, you only reminded me of myself. A boy who thought the only way to be noticed was to cut somebody else down." The words pierced deeper than any rebuke. Tommy swallowed hard, his throat tight. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the notepad, then slowly set it down, as if surrendering. For the first time since the evening began, his voice cracked with sincerity. I didn't mean it like that. I just—" He broke off, shaking his head, the apology tangled in his chest. "I'm sorry, sir." The diner watched in stunned silence. No one had forced the words from him. They came not from fear of Elvis's fame, but from a recognition that he was sitting across from someone who had lived the same struggles and carried them with dignity instead of bitterness. Elvis nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "That's all right, son. We all stumble. What matters is what you do." After Tommy looked up at him, something shifting behind his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or the first spark of understanding that there were better ways to carry pain than to spread it. Around them, the room exhaled, the crowd realizing they were witnessing something rare. Not a clash of pride, but the dismantling of it. The tourists, the truckers, the grieving widow, all sat transfixed, as though this quiet exchange revealed more about character than any performance on stage ever could. Elvis leaned back, his voice lowering so only Tommy and those closest could hear, though the room strained to catch every syllable. "Don't let the world harden you, son. It'll try. It'll push you till all you want to do is lash out. But that ain't strength. Real strength is carrying your scars without letting them turn into weapons." Tommy blinked rapidly, trying to keep control of himself. His chest rose and fell, shallow at first, then deeper, as if he was finally breathing after holding his breath for years. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. Elvis smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from experience rather than optimism. "You can. Took me years to learn, but you can. You just gotta start small." The boy nodded, unable to speak further. His apology, though simple, had shifted the entire current of the night. The mockery that had begun with laughter now closed in on redemption. The diner, though no one clapped or cheered, seemed lighter. People exchanged looks that said they would never forget what they had seen. That mercy could be more powerful than spectacle. Elvis stayed quiet after that, letting the lesson breathe. He didn't need to say more. He had shown the boy, and everyone else, that greatness wasn't just about music or fame. It was about seeing yourself in others, even when they hurt you. And for Tommy, who came in wielding cruelty like a shield, the night had cracked open a door he didn't know existed. The room had shifted again. Where there had once been laughter, then tension, then reverence, now there was a strange, almost fragile warmth. People were still hushed, but no longer because they feared the silence would break. They were protecting it, as if reluctant to disturb what had taken root. Elvis sat quietly across from Tommy, the young waiter who now seemed smaller, not in stature, but in the way pride had slipped from his shoulders. The boy had apologized, and in that exchange, something had cracked open not only in him, but in everyone watching. Then Elvis reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, as though he had known all along this moment would come. His hand emerged holding something small and worn, a handkerchief, faded and creased from years of being folded and refolded. Its edges were frayed, the fabric softened by time. The crowd leaned forward, sensing significance. Elvis held it gently, turning it over in his hands. His expression had changed, softer, shaded with memory. "I keep this with me everywhere I go," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the diner. "It belonged to my mama. She gave it to me when I was just a boy, told me never to forget where I came from. No matter how far I went, no matter what stage I stood on, this was my reminder." The diners listened, motionless. The handkerchief was nothing special in appearance, just a simple square of cloth. But in his hand, it became a relic, glowing with the weight of love and loss. "She passed before she could see most of what came my way," he continued, his eyes fixed on the fabric. "Some nights, I think about how proud she would have been. Other nights, I think about how much she would have worried. But either way, I carry her with me. Always." His gaze shifted, landing on the woman who had wept earlier, the one who had spoken of her husband lost in Vietnam. She was still dabbing her cheeks with a paper napkin, her eyes red but clear. Elvis stood, walked toward her, and placed the handkerchief in her hands. "Tonight," he said softly. "I think my mama would want you to have this. Because you've carried loss heavier than I ever knew, and you shouldn't carry it alone." The woman's breath caught audibly. She clutched the handkerchief as if it were gold, then pressed it to her chest, her lips trembling. I can't take this," she whispered. "Yes, you can," Elvis replied, his tone firm but tender. "It's meant to keep someone strong. And tonight, you're the one who needs it most." Her tears flowed freely now, but there was gratitude in them, not only grief. The crowd around her shifted uncomfortably. Many moved to tears themselves. Even the trucker wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying not to be seen. The moment was not staged. Everyone could feel it. There were no cameras, no headlines waiting to be printed. It was one human being giving away a piece of his heart, because it was the right thing to do. The woman clutched the handkerchief tightly, nodding silently. Elvis placed a hand on her shoulder, then returned to his booth. Tommy, still seated opposite, stared at him with wide eyes. For the first time, the boy saw not just the singer or the star, but the son, the man who had lost, who carried grief just like everyone else. His earlier mockery now felt shameful in ways words couldn't capture. The diner itself seemed transformed. The fluorescent lights didn't feel so harsh anymore. The smell of grease and burnt coffee didn't seem as sharp. What had been an ordinary roadside stop was now filled with a kind of reverence, as though the walls themselves understood that something sacred had been left here. Elvis leaned back, his voice calm but resonant. "Fame don't mean much. All the money, the lights, the screaming crowds, it fades when the night gets quiet. What lasts is the people you touch, the kindness you leave behind. That's all any of us get to keep." Heads nodded around the room, some eyes lowered, thoughtful. The soldier in uniform stood taller, as though the words had given him renewed strength. Elvis closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. He knew these people would never forget this night, not because of who he was, but because he had reminded them that even the biggest lives are made from the same fragile fabric as theirs. And for once, he felt at peace with the weight he carried. The diner had settled into a quiet, unlike any it had known before. The handkerchief now rested in the widow's trembling hands. The soldier stood like a sentinel of memory, and Tommy sat humbled. His earlier arrogance dissolved into silence. People barely touched their food anymore. It wasn't about eating. It was about holding on to the moment that had unfolded before them. Then, from the back, a voice rose hesitantly. "Mr. Presley." It was one of the tourists, a man in his 30s, sunburned from the desert, speaking as if he were unsure whether he had the right to ask. "Would you sing something? Not just a line, but a whole song? For all of us?" The request hung in the air. No one echoed it, but no one dismissed it either. Every person in the room felt the longing behind the words. They had heard him hum, felt the weight of his hymn, but a full song. That would seal this night forever in their hearts. Elvis hesitated, glancing around. This wasn't a stage. There was no band to carry him, no spotlight to drape him in gold. Here he was, just a man in a booth, surrounded by strangers. Part of him wanted to decline, to preserve the intimacy of what had already been shared. But another part recognized the power of music to bind what words alone could not. He rose slowly, scanning the room, and his eyes fell on a guitar leaning against a chair in the corner. One of the truckers had brought it in earlier, planning to kill time while waiting for his next haul. Now the man pushed it forward, his face alight with something between awe and generosity. Elvis took the instrument, running his hand along the worn wood. It wasn't polished, not the kind of guitar he was used to on stage, but that suited him just fine. He adjusted the strap, plucked a few strings, and nodded once. Then, without preamble, he began. The opening chords of "That's All Right" filled the diner, rough and unvarnished, stripped of the polish that made it famous. His voice carried the same youthful spark it had the day he first recorded it at Sun Studio in 1954. The rhythm was infectious, alive with the spirit of rebellion and freedom that had once shocked the world. The room responded instantly. Feet tapped under the tables, heads bobbed unconsciously, and even the soldier allowed himself a grin, as if the song pulled him back to a time before the weight of war. The widow, still clutching the handkerchief, swayed gently, her tears now mixed with laughter. Elvis sang not as a performer trying to dazzle, but as a man reconnecting with his roots. Each chord seemed to peel back the years, carrying him and everyone listening back to that first night when his music was new, dangerous, alive. The diner itself became a time machine, erasing the decades and the distance between who he had been and who he was now. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was broken, not by cautious clapping, but by thunderous applause, raw and uncoordinated. It wasn't the applause of a concert hall. It was louder, messier, and more heartfelt. People slapped the tables, stomped their feet, and cheered without restraint. The fluorescent-lit diner shook with the force of it. Tommy, the boy who had mocked him, stood awkwardly at first, then joined in, clapping until his palms stung. The applause wasn't just for the song. It was for the grace he had been shown, for the lesson the night had burned into him. When the noise finally subsided, Tommy stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. "I was wrong," he said, looking at Elvis directly. "About you, about everything. I'm sorry." The room froze, watching. Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the guitar aside, walked over, and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. His smile was small, almost private. "You don't owe me an apology, son," he said. "You just owe yourself better than what you gave tonight." The boy's throat tightened. He nodded quickly, unable to form more words. It was forgiveness without conditions, delivered not as a performance, but as truth. The crowd witnessed it, their admiration swelling once more. Forgiveness, they realized, could be more disarming than any rebuke. Elvis returned to his booth, but this time he was no longer a distant figure. He had become part of them, bound to the people in that room by music, memory, and mercy. And though the night still carried its hum of neon and the smell of grease, the Blue Star Diner had been transformed into something else entirely. A sanctuary built on an unplanned song and an act of grace no one would forget. The applause had ebbed into a reverent hush, leaving the room vibrating with the memory of music that felt older and truer than the neon night outside. Elvis stood quietly, letting the echoes fade, his gaze moving slowly across the faces gathered in that modest diner. They weren't strangers anymore. For one fleeting night, they were a community, drawn together by something beyond celebrity, beyond spectacle. He raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. The room obeyed instantly. His voice, calm and low, carried without effort. "Folks," he began, "people might laugh at your voice, your past, or the way you carry yourself. They might tell you you're not enough, that you don't belong. I've lived long enough to hear it plenty. But let me tell you something. What they mock is often the very thing that makes you who you are. If you lose that, you lose yourself. Don't give it away. Don't ever let shame steal your roots." The words landed like scripture. The soldier nodded solemnly, as though receiving orders he would carry in his heart. The widow clutched the handkerchief to her chest, tears shining but steady now. Tommy, the boy who had mocked him, lowered his head, not in shame this time, but in respect. Around the room, people shifted, the lesson sinking deep into places they hadn't expected to be touched when they walked through the diner door. Elvis glanced toward the counter, where the waitress who had first handed him a menu still stood, frozen with awe. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick stack of bills, and walked over. Without flourish, without announcement, he placed the money in her hand. "For everyone here tonight," he said softly. "The meal's on me." Gasps rippled through the diner. The gesture wasn't ostentatious. It was quiet generosity, the kind that asked for no applause. The waitress blinked rapidly, overcome, then nodded wordlessly, her hands trembling as she clutched the bills. Elvis turned toward the door. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, as though he wanted to stretch the moment a little longer. People rose instinctively as he passed, not clapping, not shouting, but standing in silence, a corridor of respect leading him out into the night. The desert air hit him first, the faint chill that crept in after midnight, the smell of hot asphalt cooling. His car waited by the curb, the engine purring softly. He paused just outside the neon glow of the Blue Star Diner's sign, the buzzing light casting a pink halo over the parking lot. Behind him, the crowd remained inside, pressing against the windows, watching in silence as if afraid that breaking it would shatter the spell. Elvis slid into the back seat of the car. The driver glanced in the mirror, awaiting instruction. For a brief moment, no words came. Elvis leaned back, letting the shadows cover him. The mask of command he had worn inside slipped away. His shoulders sagged, the fatigue of the night heavy in his bones. In the dim light, he looked not like the king of rock and roll, but like a man carrying too many memories, too much expectation, and a loneliness fame could never fill. One of the diners, a quiet man who had barely spoken all evening, stepped outside and caught sight of him through the window. He saw the difference instantly. The public figure transformed into the private soul, fragile and weary. It was a glimpse no stage or camera would ever capture. The car pulled away slowly, the neon sign shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was only another glow in the desert night. Inside the diner, no one moved right away. They sat in stunned silence, each person clutching the memory like a secret treasure. They knew they would tell the story someday, about the night Elvis Presley came into their little diner and turned it into something sacred. But for now, they held it close, savoring the weight of what they had seen. A man mocked for his accent, who answered not with anger, but with dignity, who gave away not just words and songs, but pieces of himself. And out in the desert, as the limousine carried him into the dark, Elvis Presley closed his eyes. For a few quiet minutes, he allowed himself the rarest of things, not adoration, not applause, but simple silence.